You're listening to 101 Part-Time Jobs with me, Giles Bidder, where I tend to speak to bands about their jobs off stage, what they do when they're not playing music, which is a full-time job in itself. So this one's slightly different in that we've got a very special guest, Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth, of course, and he's about to release his new solo album, By the Fire, tomorrow, the 25th of September. And this song, Cantaloupe, playing below this, is on that. I'm looking forward to digging into the full length, looking forward to spending some time with it. Given the opportunity, I wanted to speak to him about his life, about what inspires him, and how he looks back on his time in Sonic Youth. He tells me about living in London, living in New York, and how he recorded By the Fire at the Total Refreshment Centre here in London. East London's Signature Brew have been brewing music-inspired beers and supporting live music since 2011. You may know them from their collaboration beers brewed with the likes of Mastodon, Idols, Slaves, Mogwai, and a whole load more. And as a listener to this podcast, you can get 10% off their website, signaturebrew.co.uk, by using the code 101podcast at checkout. All right, here's Thurston Moore. It's an honor to speak to you. As Steve Lamacq said last year at The Great Escape, I believe that, retuning, detuning guitars for a long time now, both sides of the Atlantic.
Yes.
And you're just about to put out a new solo record.
Yes, that's true.
What's that experience been like so far?
Well, it's been great. I mean, I probably most likely would have been putting this record out regardless of the situation in 2020, of all this chaos that's surrounding the globe right now. So I'm not quite sure if the pandemic has made much of a difference in my intention, but it's funny because the record is called By the Fire, and it was called that because I was really into the idea of putting records out that deal with the aspect of total communication, like they're like these tools of communication. And the title, in a way, references this film that I remember seeing that was made on the life of Joe Strummer by the gentleman who documented the Pistols and the Clash.
Don Letts?
No, not Don Letts. Our friend Julian Temple.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, I'm a little blank right now. I don't know why. And so, and Julian Temple, who I've met and I've talked to in the past, and he's he's a sweet man. He made this great film about Joe Strummer, and in the film, he interviews the people who were friends of Joe's before he started the Clash, when he had the 101ers, and he was more kind of a rucksack kind of hippie rock and roller guy. And so the device that Julian uses is having all these people sitting around a campfire and talking and relating stories. And I really liked it. I thought it was a really powerful image, and I like the idea of just like that is as old as it gets in human history, of just like people sitting around the campfire and talking and debating and arguing and agreeing and laughing and feeling free and safe and around this fire, and passing the peace pipe as Native Americans would in their history. And so I had decided to have this record be in reference to that, and it's called By the Fire. And as it happens, we're just sort of living in this time now where there's such an uprising of people who are just really have reached the limits of dealing with demagoguery and so-called democratic countries, whether it be the UK or whether it be the USA, and very especially the USA right now, where there's quite a bit of fires happening in the streets, and those fires are kind of their own discussions. And so I felt like it in a way it was pretty conducive to what's going on right now in the moment, this recording. So
I just had to.
yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, that's it.
I just had to quickly Google that Julian Temple. It didn't stand out for me either, and I Googled it and immediately realized it's The Future is Unwritten.
The
And it's
Future is Unwritten. Yeah, it's a great film.
and yeah, it's towards the end. They all of his friends are saying how the campsite fire is so symbolic of Joe Strummer and the Clash, right? Because
Right.
it's all about stories.
That really stuck with me when I saw the film. It really struck me, and I always held on to it. And so this title is, in a way, is referencing that. I mean, for me personally, and so there you go.
And you've been living in London for
It's going on about 7-8 years now.
You know, Sonic Youth have always kind of appealed to Europeans as much as I'm 29. So a lot of that I've read about rather than experienced myself. Did you always feel comfortable in England and Europe?
Well, I certainly didn't know the England that I know now because it was always a passing through situation. Although in the 80s when we came here and Paul Smith, who was running the label Double Vision for Cabaret Voltaire coming out of Mute Records, was Daniel Miller, and that the whole situation there, and then like that relationship with Rough Trade. So we jumped into that through this gentleman Paul Smith, who wanted to put out Bad Moon Rising, our third proper LP, more or less, and in the mid '80s, and so we kind of decamped here for a while. And it's funny because I live in this area of London called Stoke Newington. And I used to stay in Stoke Newington in the 80s, and it was quite a different vibe then. This area of London has really changed quite a bit. I think there's been a lot of movement in the kind of lifestyles that are here, I suppose. And
what do you remember about that sort of time back then? What
well,
were your impressions?
it was a more sort of modest kind of means of living here. I think families had more modest means, and it's a bit more moneyed now. And I think a lot of like parts of London are like that, where there's kind of real estate migration, where it kind of it sort of caters to people who sort of have more revenue, and so it's a bit of a it's a bit of a conflict of settlement, because you're kind of living in places that it kind of makes you curious, because it makes me curious in New York City. It's this sort of like the idea of like real estate sort of giving more monetary value to a place that didn't always have it. And so the people who can't afford it, where do they go? They just keep moving. So there's this migration that's always happening because of economics. So when I lived here, when I used to stay here in the 80s, I used to stay with my friend Richard Boone, who was working at Rough Trade. He was the gentleman who came out of Manchester, who started New Hormones Records and put out the first Buzzcocks 7-inch Spiral Scratch in '77. And
Cool.
so he's somebody I knew from Rough Trade, and he still lives here. He was like he was a head librarian at the Stoke Newington Library until it closed. And so at that time, I used to just come here and stay with him, and I would come up to the High Street and take the bus into Central London just to go looking at record stores and bookstores. And but at the same time, in the 80s, what was happening around in this area of London was a lot of experimental music was happening. A lot of like people devoting themselves to free improvisation music as a genre of music. The Vortex pub was here, where a lot of music was happening with people like John Stevens and Derek Bailey and Evan Parker. And when I started getting into that music, I would take a bus to Stoke Newington to see it at the Vortex. And remembering Stoke Newington as the place I used to stay, it was a bit of a wild area. I was never. I always felt like it was at the end of the earth because I didn't know London that well. I only knew what a visitor would know. So living here, actually, when I came back to Stoke Newington, I didn't recognize it because it had become quite gentrified.
Wow.
And instead of the Vortex, there's a Nando's Chicken, and across the street is a Whole Foods, and it's just it's a different demographic than I recall.
For the namesake of this podcast, it's a podcast that I started after touring in my old band. I always found it fascinating speaking to band members about what they did between tours. Mm-hmm. And there's loads of things I think this subject applies to you, because, I mean, we're talking about London now. I mean, I pay £500 a month. That's dirt cheap. Yeah. How can you know, not a lot of people can do that. And playing in bands now is expensive. Practice rooms are expensive now. Yeah. From what I've read about the 80s is that this linear path wasn't quite there yet. So do you kind of jump into the unknown, and you kind of had to immerse yourself in that rather than take a decision?
Decisions were always for the most part, for me, were in the moment. And sometimes you could have a sort of a long vision. I don't think the band had any kind of long future vision until we actually sort of made a little bit of money by signing to Geffen Records in 89, 90. And it allowed us to sort of not work day jobs anymore. All through the 80s, it was basically working day jobs and then quitting them, or being able to take that time off to go on the tours we did, which were basically break-even tours if you were lucky. It was never, the agenda was never about capital. It was, the idea was that if you could have enough money for petrol and some sustenance from show to show, from town to town, from venue to venue, you were doing okay. There was really no models of success at that point for bands playing experimental post-punk music at all. I mean, I guess if there was, it would be like possibly like Public Image Limited or something like that, a really high profile group like that. But that group already had a legacy by coming out of something as world renowned as the Sex Pistols. But most bands, I mean, be it like Swell Maps or This Heat or the Raincoats or whatever, you all kind of were in the same boat as far as like the compensation you got for making records and playing gigs, which was probably just enough, if you were lucky, to maybe pay that month's rent. And so you'd be offset by having day jobs. So not to have a day job was a huge, huge, huge thing. And that was after being in a band for 10 years and coming at the beginning of the 90s. I think we sort of found ourselves in a very fortuitous place when the band Nirvana became quite nova and drew a lot of attention to bands like us, playing the music we played because it was in the light and it was in the wake. It was around the glow of that band, and it kind of came into our favor. And so our profile became quite high throughout the 90s. I was just talking to somebody, a good friend of mine, Lydia Lunch, on the phone the other day, and she was talking about like how she used to see Sonic Youth with 15 people on a Tuesday night at CBGB's, and then 15 years later watching us in the 90s playing in front of 15,000 people and playing the same music. And just wondering how that was working, and like how much sustainability there would be with playing that kind of music. And so I mean, it just sort of it was a very interesting thing. But yeah, I mean, as far as like downtime, for me, it's like touring has always been really a bit of a constant. So when there would be like a 2-3 month downtime, it was very unusual. And I guess most people have told you, like, coming off tours, there was always this kind of PTD, this post-tour depression that would set. And I still sort of, I think I've conquered that to some degree. Maybe it's because I've been doing it so long, and I feel like there's still a bit of a confused state when you come back from traveling constantly, because it's not just traveling. It's just like it's intensified transitions. You know, you're sort of like banging from one place to the next, and your sleep patterns are completely disruptive. I mean, it was interesting when Sonic Youth did sort of a higher profile. We were being a little more catered to, and there was a comfort zone there where you were being taken care of, and that to me is really interesting in retrospect, because I have a bit of a conflict about that, of just like having people making your decisions for you, management and tour managers, and
You're the talent.
yeah. So you're the talent, and you're sort of like, okay, you're on stage at this time, do it, get off. Here's your bed. We'll wake you when you have to do something. And to me, that was like kind of a gracious thing to have. It was kind of fun. But at the same time, I kind of like calling my own shots. I like being responsible for my own measures.
I imagine you must have been very self-motivated in the first place to do it.
Well, we certainly took care of our own business for quite some time before other people stepped in to do it for us. And so to return to that kind of lifestyle it wasn't an alien lifestyle. I think there's a lot of people who get involved with music and they have a really quick ascension into popularity, and they have that kind of system of being catered to really quickly. And then when it disappears, which it usually does, I think they feel a little spoiled, a little lost, that they can't have that anymore. They're not sure how to subsist without it. So, I mean, I wonder about that sometimes, especially in certain genres of music where you have a massive hit, or you have at least some kind of massive recognition for, if you're lucky, a year or 6 months to a year, and then it is gone, and it never really returns to that kind of glorious explosion again. But your name still exists in the books, and you maybe cashed in all this money, and you bought the big house and the car, and then now what? And I know there's a lot of people out there who must have had that experience in their lives, and it happens really young. And now when you're kind of in your later years, in your 50s, 60s, etc., it's just like, look, you're always sort of in a way defined by that success that you had at such a young age.
100%. My old band that used to tour quite a bit, we went to Australia once. We played Reading and Leeds, did some really cool things for being 21-year-olds. And what I can look back now is that I knew all about how I wanted to get to the point I wanted to get to, but I had no plan on what to do once I got there.
Right.
And I wonder if that's very similar for a lot of people.
I think it is. I mean, because especially at that age when most people get involved with being in bands, you're just out of your teens, in your early 20s, and it's usually, for bands that have some modicum of success, it happens at that initial state when you're kind of exciting to the listenership, to the public, to the critics, because you're new. You're only new once, and you could keep reinventing yourself like Bowie did or whatever, but that's a rarity to find somebody who's successful at that kind of consistent reinvention, the consistent renewal of your of your presence in the critical world. That's very rare. I mean, and Bowie certainly had it, but or the Stones, the Stones sort of have it.
Yeah,
but,
their new stuff's great. The Stones, what was the last one? Okay, well, the last one they put out was one from Goat's Head Soup, but the one before that, it was great. It was kind of the production was kind of naff, but it works.
Right. So I don't think, it'd be kind of interesting if, like, to talk to like Bill Wyman or something about, like, do you have post-tour depression, or do you just or do you just choose one of your like fabulous houses to go and chill out in?
Yeah. But what you say about, you're only new once, it makes me think, and, I don't want to be negative or whatever, but like as a rock music journalist, my biggest qualms of day-to-day life is the PR release that says, new thing, fresh out the gate,
Right.
Or like come back from trials and tribulations,
Right. Or you've never heard such a thing in your life.
How did you navigate doing that? Because you've been doing it so long now, and you can hear this record sounds so fresh, Thurston.
Yes, dude. I'm brand new, baby. Yeah. I've sort of got to the point where when I start to have creative impulse, I don't really consider I don't consider the standards of the marketplace of independent music when I'm doing it. Let's put it that way. And so, and for better or worse, I probably I've been a little more focused on trying to play that a little more succinctly, but I don't. And when I really at this point in my life, I'm just turning 62 in a few days, and I just sort of like. I have this vibe of just like I really like sort of staying put and sort of writing music at home, and which I've always done anyway. I've never been a studio person. I've never had my own sort of like recording apparatus that I sort of go and have tape machines and plug in. I mean, I'm lucky to be able to turn on a cassette recorder, for God's sakes. I'm very sort of a bit of a Luddite when it comes to technology. I sort of know my way around things. Sonic Youth had our own sort of home studio system that we recorded in, and when Jim O'Rourke was in the band, he was like our vanguard producer / mixing engineer, and we had this great analog Neve board that we worked on, but that's all gone. And I never really thought of it was something I could walk into because I could hardly turn on the light switch. So it was always it was a bit of a group effort, and I just kind of like I brought in ideas, and those ideas would germinate at home, sitting on the couch or sitting on the bed with a guitar, and I would try to remember it, or I would put it on a cassette tape, or I would flip open my laptop and try to record it using like whatever is on there. Yeah. And so that's as good as it gets. I mean, I just recently got like an 8-track little digital Zoom machine that I use in the most basic Tenet, and so and I've been enjoying it. It's like it's kind of like all these years later, I've actually figured out how to do something like that. But I sort of more into just being creating without having to sort of deal with the technological aspects of it. So it's all about the ideas, and then sort of going somewhere where they can be sort of made manifest.
Did you ever have difficulty recreating the same vibrations that you made at home, because you might be playing on a Strat and you got this sound, you got this vibration, but did you ever find it hard to recreate that in the studio?
Sometimes, but I've gotten to the point where I know how to sort of deal with that. And, I mean, because if I play here through like a little tiny shoebox amplifier, it has a very cool sound. And
it does.
And I know I'm not going to really get that sound by going to the studio and plugging into my 2x12, 100-watt PV combo amp. It's just going to be, that is a different vibe. And so
I'm not sure if you're a fan, but Jawbreaker on that Dear You record, like a lot of that sort of primary guitar that you hear is from one of those shoebox Marshalls.
Yeah. I mean, it's cool. I mean, I know a lot of people work that way. I mean, I'm sure I know that I've always heard that Jimmy Page uses tiny little amps, and Neil Young used like a tiny little Fender Tweed 10-inch amplifier on stage that he would use as a monitor, just so that's what he was listening to. And on stage, he was listening to himself play through that. And that was what's coming through his stage front.
Great. When you were touring, did you find it hard? I mean, obviously you've got to have a life off the road. Did you find it hard to kind of, I don't know, keep that aligned, I suppose?
I have a recollection of like doing really lengthy tours and coming back and then having days of just being rather confounded about how to get through those days. And then sort of finding some kind of pace, and then the anxiety when you know that like a major tour is coming up within a few weeks, and like getting prepared for it, and that anxiety of being on the road. And I still sort of go through it a little bit, especially coming into a tour, like getting ready to go and get into a van or it's been a while since I had the luxury of being on a bus tour, but that kind of vibe. And I'm really looking into doing more touring using trains because I think it makes a little more ecological sense, which is kind of important more so than ever right now. And so I the last little tour I did was all by train. But it's like when you have as many guitars as I carry around, it gets to be it's a little much.
Well, if you have to have two splitters, one for the people and then one for the gear, it's better one than two, right?
Yeah.
Trains are expensive in the UK,
and then trains aren't exactly a cheaper alternative either. So,
do you have any superstitions about touring?
No, but I remember somebody in Australia when we went there in the 90s and going there, and everybody felt like they were in a really good place, and the promoter of that tour was this woman who said, like, well, I made sure that you came here at a time when everything was in a good line astrologically, and so she was very sensitive to like the moon placement for our tour. And I was like, God, that is so cool. That is so smart. I was like, I wish every promoter would sort of have that same regard for like touring. It's just like, this is when you should tour. When this is, when these planets are lined up, it's perfect for you. But so sometimes I have a little anxiety about that. Like, God, I hope the planets are lined up okay. And sometimes you'll go out on tour and like, oh, we're actually supposedly there's some, the horoscopes say there's some really dark times we're coming into. I'm like, oh, great, thank you. That was really cool, Or you're touring. We coming from the USA, we knew nothing about European and UK football. And so, when we first toured, sometimes you would run into you would run into conflicts with people's football viewing schedules, which wasn't something that we really had to deal with so much in the USA. But it was really something that we realized, like, you do not tour Europe, during the finals or something like that. Because
that was something I've learned as I've got older, that you can like punk rock and football.
You can,
yeah.
Oh yeah.
I feel like as a teenager, they're pretty paradoxical things.
I remember reading an interview with Liam Gallagher, the singer.
Yeah, big City fans.
And he, but like asking about like why he decided to sing with his brother, who's playing electric guitar, and he said, like, well, I was more interested in football, and I thought people who played in bands were rather poofy. But then I heard somebody else doing it, and I thought like, well, I could do better than that. So he said it was always a bit of a competitive thing in the way that football was, and so I kind of got into it with that kind of mindset, and I was like, wow, that explains so much.
Being such a colonial country, I think there is this weird ingrained competition in people in the UK.
Yeah, I realize that. I see that as well. I mean, for the most part. And yeah, I think you see that all over the place. You see that in America too. I think we sort of came out of a scene all through the 80s of playing, like the underground music scene in the 80s, like when we sort of found like-minded bands that we connected with, be it Meat Puppets or the Minutemen or Butthole Surfers and Mudhoney later on. And it's like there was never really a sense of competition. It was definitely a sense of camaraderie and a sense of fascination with what each person was doing, what each band was doing. And I felt like that factor of competitiveness sort of became more prevalent after the success that happened with a band like Nirvana. And I know that knowing the Nirvana lads, they kind of also came out of what I was talking about, and realizing that they created this situation where all of a sudden there was this new kind of somewhat bogus goal to to achieve, because it was so outrageously different than what had anybody had experienced up to that point, except for maybe the only bands from our scene that had experienced anything like that was REM. But the REM was a bit of an anomaly. They sort of came out of that underground scene, but they kind of became quite um, accepted in the mainstream fairly early on. But they still had that sort of foothold into the same world we were coming out of.
I was just thinking of REM because in Trouble Boys, that Replacements book, Paul Westerberg talks about them. Kind of has this kind of love-hate relationship with them, and
Mm-hmm.
it kind of I read it from a place of maybe some unwanted, I don't know, not unwanted jealousy, but you know what I mean, somewhere like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Well, it's hard. It's hard not to sort of be sort of, I don't know if competitive is the word, but possibly envious of someone's success when they have it in the um, in a place where that success never existed before. So, like in the '80s, there was no band that really had any bigger success than any other. Really, I mean, like a band like us started getting more popular, and people. I remember bands would look at us like, "Wow, you guys are really." Everybody's writing about you and people are coming to see you, but it was never this thing where it got too out of hand. So there were, like in the hardcore scene, like a band like Black Flag or the Dead Kennedys were like sort of kingpin bands of that scene, but it was always there was always a lot of respect for it. And they were sort of like the perennial headliner bands, but they would always have, 14 bands supporting them on every single gig. So it was always this kind of really familial thing. It was like a family of in the scene, and we felt like that was sort of what was always going on. But the Nirvana explosion really sort of changed that, and I think that kind of was maybe a bit of a weird thing for those three. Uh, for a while. Certainly it was. I mean, certainly it was for Kurt, and I think for Chris and Dave, it was just like they both processed it in their own individual ways, with good regard too. I mean, I just read this book by Paul Hanley of the Fall called "Have a Bleeding Guess," which is all about the making of Hex Induction Hour, and then and I followed that by reading a book that was written earlier by his brother Steve Hanley, who was the bass player in the Fall, in that same period of that group, uh, called the Big Midweek, and they're both really hilarious books because a lot of them just sort of deal with their de facto leader, the singer Marky Smith.
Yeah.
It seemed like it's really funny because Marky Smith is in those books is constantly at odds with bands that are familial to him coming out of Manchester, be it the Smiths or even Echo and the Bunnymen, and bands that he came up with, because the Fall start fairly early. They start in 76, 77. And so when these bands start making more critical headway than the Fall, uh, it's really, it's kind of it's amusing to hear Marky Smith's asides about these bands and instantly hating them because of their success. So, and it's in that hate is just based on one thing: is that like, yeah, you're doing better than us, in the marketplace. So I mean, what's the Morrissey song? We hate it when our friends become successful, or whatever.
I feel like maybe we should read those books by the Hanley brothers after reading Marky Smith's book himself, Renegade.
Oh God. Well, Renegade is just a rambunctious kind of rant of a book, and it's fun to read, but it's just like it's a wild long night at the pub.
It gives you more insight as to him, like, because it's just like there is no solution to this person.
But the Hanley books are great. I mean, they're very insightful to not only with that gentleman's psyche, but just sort of like the psychology of being in a band, even if it's a band as radical as the Fall. But it's really great if you've been in a band to read those books and to sort of, in one way, relate exactly to what that is, that dynamic is, because it's like it goes it's hot and cold from one day to the next. And you know that you've toured with a band, like with that, you are sitting on each other's laps every day. I mean, it's like you're stuck with each other in buses and vans and cars and trains and airplanes. And then when you get to the gig, you're even closer because you're all stuck in the little dressing room facing each other, waiting. Yeah, it's trying to get that kind of sort of comfort from being inebriated. It's like
Yeah.
it's an experience that you can only really have by doing it and having that. And I I've been sort of writing a lot about it lately. I've just been thinking about like what that dynamic is, and what is really there's something very uh, unappealing about it, but at the same time, it's like you wouldn't trade it for the world. That experience.
Well, you feel like this is your one chance.
Yeah, yeah.
There's an element of that I think a lot of people have, and it makes me think two things. First of all, I found that it must be. I personally found it incredibly hard to feel like a professional, like it's a job, like something that I should do neatly and as well as I can. When I stink like shit, and I'm having to smile when I don't want to smile.
Right. Well, yeah.
And that was something that massively appealed to me about Marky Smith's Renegade, is that he was just completely unapologetic about being like, no, you're shit. Let's get a new person. And it's taken me, I live in Deptford now in Southeast London. It's got such a rich musical history down here. And actually it's only in the last few years have I been able to feel like somewhat of a professional in what I do in music journalism, because it's all around me. History's, Dire Straits played their first gig here, and Squeezer from just around the corner.
Yeah, Deptford, fun city.
Exactly. Who was that run by? What, the brother Stuart Copeland?
Yeah,
one of the brothers. Editor's note: this is actually Miles Copeland that ran Deptford Fun City. And you talking about Stoke Newington, going up there now? There's a few cool places. Total Refreshment Centre.
Well, a lot of my new record is done at Total Refreshment Centre. I really like that place. It's kind of what I look for in a kind of community art space. And then up in Dalston is Cafe Auto, which is very close. Which it's just to my good luck that one of the premier experimental music clubs of the world right now it's just up the street, Cafe Auto. So, but it's all everything's been shut down. It's funny because when I sort of would get off the road, I would always sort of I think annoy a lot of people, or not annoy people, but maybe I don't know if let's see what the word it would be, like maybe astound people by the fact that getting off the road, the one thing I start doing is I start going to clubs to hear music. And in one way, it's sort of like when you're kind of, I know a lot of people who are in bands, and when they get off of touring, the last thing you want to do is go into a club and hear music.
Right.
They've just been doing that every night for like the last 3 months. And it's just like, forget about it. Like, and so you just you veg out, you stay away. But I used to sort of like regret having to go on tour sometimes because there were certain gigs I would miss by going on tour.
Yeah. Do you remember any big ones that you were really, really upset about?
Well, God, really early on, before Sonic Youth, I was in a band, bit of an art school band called The Coachmen. And one of the few gigs we had, 78, 79, when we were playing in New York, one night we had one of our rare gigs, which was like good news, or it should be good news, but it just happened to be on the very same night as the very first time Public Image was playing in New York City. That was not cool, because Public Image to me were everything. That was just like they defined what was progressive and groundbreaking, and what was happening in new post-punk music. And they had come to New York, and they were playing at this place called the Palladium, and we were playing at some a place I can't even think of what the name of it was, and we played this gig. I think maybe 20 people were there, and were they? I don't even know if they were there to see us. We were playing with another band called Sick Dick and the Volkswagens. Which, in retrospect, you know what? I'm really glad I did play that gig, because Sick Dick and the Volkswagens are this really curious sort of secondary, tertiary kind of cog in the whole no wave scene of New York City, and they were kind of a strange free jazz, free noise group. The guitar player also had a trio, still does, more or less, called Borbeta Magus, which is two powerhouse saxophone players and noise guitar. And so when I tell people that we played with Sick Dick and the Volkswagens, well, it matters who I'm talking to, but some people are like, oh my God, like that's like a mythic thing. Like, whoever saw that band is like, well, I not only saw them, I played with them on this same night as Public Image played at them. And yes, yeah, yes.
The way you describe them makes me think
Yeah.
there are two bands, Folly Group and Black Country New Road, the latter of which I'm sure you must have heard. Sunglasses. What a song.
Yeah, they're great. They're great. And so yeah, but not only did I miss Public Image's debut premiere concert in New York City, but a couple of days later, when I was bemoaning the fact that I had missed it, and I was at work, and I was working at Masterdisc, which was a studio, a mastering studio for records. I was working as a shipping clerk there. And Ed Ballman, who ran a record store and a label called 99 Records, which put out records by Liquid and ESG and Bush Tetras and Glenn Bronco. And I knew him from the store. Anyway, he had come up to Masterdisc to master the very first release that he was putting out on his label, which was the first Glenn Bronco record, 12-inch record, lesson number 1 for electric guitar. And I started talking to him. I was like, oh, this is cool that you're putting a record out. And I was like, did you go see Public Image the other night at the Palladium? He's like, yeah, it was great. I was like, yeah, man, I missed it. My band was playing the same night. And I'm really bummed out. And I can't believe I missed that gig. It's like, well, didn't you see them last night? And I froze. My blood went cold. I was like, what are you talking about? He goes, oh, they did a secret gig at Great Gildersleeves, which is a club that was right next to CBGB. It was a bit of a heavy metal glam rock place. And Public Image had done a secret show there the night before. And I was in my little flat watching Three's Company on a black and white television set and smoking cigarettes.
Oh no.
And I was just like, I stood there like thinking like, are you kidding me? Like, not a, like I had no excuse. And I had lived like maybe like 5-minute walk away from this place. And then through the years, everybody I would meet saw that gig at Great Gildersleeves. It was like everybody. I mean, everybody saw that gig. It became this thing of myth, and it was like, and sometimes I would just like, I would like lie awake at night, nauseous, thinking like, what? How could have that happened? You know, and then when the advent of video started happening and VHS tapes started happening, and all of a sudden there was footage that was available, and I saw the gig. And you know what? It looked pretty cool. At that point, there was a lot of water went under the bridge by that point.
Yeah.
I think it's probably on YouTube. If you put like Pill at Great Gildersleeves, it's probably on YouTube. But I did finally see them. And they came back after Flowers of Romance, and they played this place called the Ritz, which is a huge ballroom in Manhattan. And I went to that gig. And to rub a little salt into the wound, Public Image decided, let's play this gig behind a movie screen. There was a huge video movie screen at the Ritz. It was considered the largest one in the world, and it hung in front of this rather large stage. And then when bands would come out, they would roll it up, and the band would play. But it was like between bands, it would come down, and there would be these huge videos of like Michael Jackson's Thriller or whatever on the screen while you waited for the next band. And so Public Image had this great idea of playing behind. This is like 1983 or something, and 84, and they played behind this screen, and the audience, which I was a member of, began to riot and throw things at the screen and tear it down, and the band ran away. So again, never saw. I went to see Public Image, but didn't really see them. And except for there was one thing I really remember from that gig is Keith Levine running out in front of the screen and waving his arms, telling people to stop, and everybody started throwing pints at him, and then John Lydon, his Image, they had two cameras on the side of the stage filming them behind the screen, they would show up on the screen once in a while, and that made the audience even angrier. And at one point, John Lydon's face was on the screen, and he was taunting the audience, like this huge Wizard of Oz face, going like, "Silly fucking audience, silly fucking audience." It was wonderful.
And were you ever tempted to do much, visual imagery stuff?
Yeah,
over the years.
Yeah, I mean, Sonic Youth did a lot of like visual stuff as we toured, and we had every tour was, especially when we were like touring big time, we would have like a couple of LDs, a couple of lighting designers come with us and do some kind of escapade, and so and a lot of times it was co-created with us, so they were always kind of quite cool. I thought they were quite different. And when I do my solo touring, when I say solo touring, I mean me and my group, James Edwards and Deb Googe, and Steve Shelley and Jem Dolton and John Lineker. And when I go out, we my girlfriend Eva has films that she shows that are really cool, and so we show those films sometimes. And it really matters what kind of venue it is.
Right. I saw you in Zurich in a kind of boxy type venue, maybe like 500 cap. Was it Zurich?
Possibly, yeah.
A couple of years ago. But it was cool. It was very striking.
But there was no visuals.
I remember it was quite dark.
That's usually probably just sort of like the lighting people at the club. And I always try to tell them not to make it dark. But they like it dark. And when I go see a gig, I really kind of want to see the people on stage, and I want to study them. And that's always a thing for me. And if it's too much lights, or if it's all about the lights, I generally am bored or I'll leave. And or if I can't see them, I leave. I want to see what they're doing. I want to see the process. I want to see the decision making that's going on. That's really important to me, and I've always gone to gigs hoping that's what I'll see. And so if I go to like huge concerts and I'm too far away, it's a bit of a bummer. I try to I'm very tall, and so I would always try to get to the very front of the stage, much to the chagrin of just about everybody behind me. And usually I would turn around and there would be this little void, like a V formation of a void behind me. People grimacing, like it matters what you do. David Bowie had like the big neon light tour. I remember seeing that in the 70s. I thought, that was like every house light was up in the venue, and that was kind of interesting. I know that when Fugazi first came over, I remember people were talking about it, how they came over, and instead of having lights per se, they just had a couple of clip lamps clipped on either side of the stage, and that was their lights for the stage. And everybody thought that was just completely brilliant, and and it was, but it's like, well, who's fooling who kind of thing. But it's but then I remember playing a gig with the Horrors.
Yeah.
I played with them. They asked me to play a song with them on at some Enemy Awards thing a few years ago. And I rehearsed this song with them at their rehearsal space, and it was easy enough, and it was kind of cool. And I was like, okay, great. And so I came out, and I couldn't I couldn't see what I was doing. I mean, they had so many psychotic lights going on. I was just like, it was insane. I couldn't see them. I couldn't see my hands. I couldn't see anything except for like this. I felt like I was in some hyper visual like explosion, and that ran throughout their whole set. Like you couldn't really see the band. You would see certain weird shadows of the band kind of once in a while, but it was just all lasers just flashing everywhere. I mean, it was kind of cool, but it was just like, like they're kind of interesting looking cats. I think the audience would have liked to maybe catch a glimpse or two, but
You made a lot of the new record at Total Refreshment Center. How did that come about? What was your introduction there, and who engineered it?
A fellow there named Christian, who runs the studio there, and he engineered it. But I also used this another local studio cat here named Sid Kemp, and he worked with me a little bit. I worked in different places. But I generally did a lot of the, let's say, post production. I put it all together pretty much at Total Refreshment Center. I found that place because I was looking for a place to record something very quickly a couple of years ago, and somebody had told me about it. And it has this really long history. It's a place that has lots of heavy dub reggae sessions that go on there and parties and more sort of Africani music events there. When I was working there doing this record at one point, I was mixing, and Tony Allen, who has just passed away, the great percussionist, was playing in the next room, and I, rehearsing with some local people. Things like that were happening there. It's a really sort of like there's like different artist studios there. It's a real community arts place. So I really like it, and I think there's a playing room there that I like. It's like a good rehearsal space. It's very nearby. I could ride my bicycle over there, which I appreciate. London's best kebab place is right across the street. It's called Best Kebab. It's on the I guess you would call it Kingsland Road, and Folden Street, Foulden, which is the street. Folden Street is where Total Refreshment Center is, so it's right on the corner of Kingsland Road and Folden Street. It's a destination kebab. We're lucky to have it here, and I'm a vegetarian too, so it's like slim pickings for me. But they make it work.
You get some good veg in the Turkish places around there, and I imagine
that's true. Well, I'm pescatarian, so you can get some good grilled sea bass around here.
Excellent. Well, I like to keep these about an hour long. It's been great to hear these stories, Thurston. I'd love it if you came down to Deptford. I'll show you around.
Oh, please do. I've always wanted to go. I mean, the MC5 played in Deptford, so that's like
really.
I think so. I think there's some legend about the MC5 playing there.
Have you found anything in London? Any new hobbies?
Oh yeah. I mean, when I first moved here, I really, as I was getting myself together to sort of play music with different people here, and that happened really organically. Meeting James Edwards, and then Debbie Googe coming in, and that was really wonderful. And then Eva and I would just walk miles and miles and miles around here, North London. We would just jump on buses, which is a great way to sort of really sort of see the geography of the city. But I remember I would go to like secondhand bookstores, which I really love doing, and London still has good secondhand bookstores. And I would go up to Cecil Court and hit those bookstores. But there was a gentleman in one of those bookstores who was a poet, and I was out telling him about how fascinated I was by a London that I'd never realized by coming here for 20 years. And he said, well, even people who are born and raised in London, the city reveals itself distinctly to each person in its own way, and it's really layered. I mean, because it's so old and it has such an incredible history that there's just like there's these layers of ghosts and spirits in London, beneath the cobblestones. And so he said it's continually fascinating for people who live here. It's like there's always discovery happening, and it reveals itself really personally. And I found that to be very true. And
there's a block of flats just down here. So Deptford's kind of right on the Thames, right? And so we live at the north side of the high street. So we're just maybe 3 or 5 minutes away from the Thames, which is awesome. When the tide's
incredible,
go onto the little beach bit. But on the way there is like a block of old council flats, and the railings outside, right? I've lived in exactly the same for me. I've lived in, North London, grew up there all my life, moved down here, did not realize the gates of these council estates are old, were you taken out from there, used as stretchers used as stretchers in World War II, and then replaced back in there as gates.
Oh, that's great. That's amazing.
And it's just unreal. And things like that, you're like, wow. If you weren't interested in it through a book, that makes you interested.
Yeah, I love it. And I love traveling around England and just sort of like seeing, when I would tour a lot with Sonic Youth, like doing shows in London and Manchester and Bristol, whatever, you would just go to these hot spots. And when I moved here, I did a tour in a Volvo station wagon with the folk blues guitar player Michael Chapman, and that was wonderful because we just played everywhere and played these little pubs, and that was. And so I still do that, and I really love doing that, and so I look forward to doing that again as soon as as soon as the Tories relinquish power and get rid of the bozo, so we can have some real good times again.
Excellent.
I shouldn't speak about civics or politics. We're citizens of the world, are we not?
We are. All right. Thank you so much, Thurston.
Okay, thanks. It was really nice talking to you.
I've been working all day for me mate on the side, running around like a blue-ass fly. I've been working all day for me mate. Every bleeding minute I've been on the go, up and down the ladder like a fiddler's elbow. I've been working all day for me mate.
This is a Mighty Moon Media podcast.